In this video, we're going to look at the book of 2 Kings. So if you remember last time from 1 Kings, we said that originally 1st and 2nd Kings were one book or one scroll. And then when they translated the text from Hebrew into Greek, it was too large to fit on one scroll, so they arbitrarily broke it into two books. When we left off in 1 Kings, King Ahab had died in battle. And if you remember, there was no longer just one kingdom, but there was the southern tribe of Judah and the southern kingdom of Judah and the northern kingdom of Israel. Okay, let me say that again. So a southern kingdom of Judah and a northern kingdom of Israel. So now let's answer our 8 questions. Who wrote the book of 2 Kings? Again, there's no firm internal or external evidence either way. Most people think that either Jeremiah or Ezra penned 2 Kings. When we think about who it was written to, at the time of the writing, the nation had already gone into captivity, and it was just a history record of what had happened to send them into captivity. When we think about how much time is covered, it was approximately 300 years. It covers the last 12 kings of the northern kingdom, and that was Israel, and it covers the last 16 tribes of the southern kingdom, and that was Judah, called Judah. It was Judah and Benjamin. So now let's think about the main idea of 2 Kings. We see the downfall of Israel, that would be the northern tribe, in chapters 1 through 17, during the reign of 11 evil kings. So Israel never had a good king. They were all evil. So if you remember last week when we talked about 1 Kings, it was Jeroboam that kind of got the ball rolling for the evil, and they just never fully recovered. Then Assyria comes and takes the Israelites into captivity. So chapters 18 through 25 detail the downfall of Judah under 16 kings. Now there was a few good kings sprinkled in those 16 kings, but for the most part they were evil too. And the book ends with the southern kingdom going into Babylonian captivity. Some notable characters in 2 Kings: the prophets Elijah and Elisha, Naaman, Jehu, who was a king of Israel, Hezekiah, which was a good king of Judah, the prophet Isaiah, he comes up in the book of 2 Kings, Manasseh, and he was the son of Hezekiah, and he was wicked for the most part, and then a king of Judah named Josiah. So now let's think about some notable events. Elijah is taken to heaven in a whirlwind. He doesn't die, he just goes straight to heaven in a whirlwind. Elisha takes over as a prophet for Elijah. So there's several miracles recorded concerning Elisha. Some of the notable ones are the widow's oil, Elisha, and the Shunammite woman. And then later on, Elisha raises the Shunammite woman's son from the dead. Naaman the leper is healed of his leprosy. Jehu, now remember, he was a king of Israel. He slaughters all of Ahab's descendants. So Ahab dies at the end of 1 Kings. Well, here in 2 Kings, we see all of his descendants being slaughtered. Elisha dies, and Israel, like we've already mentioned, Israel goes into captivity because of the sin of idolatry. Hezekiah, he's a good king, but he fathers a son who is very evil, and his name was Manasseh. Then Josiah was a very good king, probably the best king besides King David, despite of having an evil father and an evil grandfather. So Josiah repairs the temple, he finds the law, he restores the Passover. But then eventually he dies, and there's just several evil kings that reign until Babylon comes up against Jerusalem and takes the people captive in about 3 waves of captivity. There was 3 different times they came and took the people. So when we think about 2 Kings and the timeline, during 2 Kings chapter 1 through chapter 16 is the divided kingdom. And then in 2 Kings 17, that's where the northern tribe, Israel, goes into Assyrian captivity. So Judah is left alone. So that's that time period of Judah alone. When we think about Jesus in the book of 2 Kings, any king you see that's reigning in the tribe of Judah, that's going to be in Jesus' earthly seed line through which the Messiah would come. Also, again, it just reiterates the need for a perfect king when we see all these wicked kings and the results of having wicked, evil leadership. And then again, we just see the awful results of division. And remember, in the Gospel of John, chapter 17, Jesus earnestly prays for unity for all the believers. So this is something that Jesus felt really strongly about, and 2 Kings is just shows how ugly division is. So let's wrap up by thinking about why we should study 2 Kings. We see that God will not let sin go unpunished. Way back in the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, God details some blessings that the people would obey, but he also details some curses. And the curses happened. God is not going to let sin go unpunished. Also, we see that God takes the sin of idolatry very serious, because that was the main trip up for the nation. They just kept dabbling in idolatry, and sometimes just being all in idolatry and totally turning their back on God. But either way, God was not pleased whether they were dabbling or all in. Also, we see examples of free will. A lot of times you would have a king who was just very evil, and then his son would be a very good king, or vice versa. You would have a father who was a good king, but then the son would end up being evil. So that just shows us free will, that we have a choice no matter how we were raised, whether it was good or bad. We have a choice whether to follow God or not follow God. And I'll end this by saying that 2 Kings proves that God rules in the kingdoms of men to fulfill his will. It wasn't that Babylon or Assyria were more righteous than the nation of Israel and the nation of Judah, but God used them to punish his people for idolatry. So we see that God works his will, and it's a mystery to us how he does it or why he does it, but it just shows a beautiful example that he does do it. So I hope this has been helpful. I wanted to share one thing before I closed. Last week I mentioned having a chart as you read through. So this is the one that I used, and you can see it has the kings of Judah on this side and the kings of Israel on this side. This is where the kingdom is not divided here. And it just really helped me as I was reading through to understand if it was a king reigning in Judah or a king reigning in Israel. And then once I figured that out, to see who was reigning opposite of him, reigning at the same time as him in the southern kingdom or the northern kingdom, vice versa. So I would recommend having something either download on your phone or a paper copy as you dig into 1st and 2nd Kings. It's just really going to help you keep it separate in your mind as to which tribe you're reading, or which nation you're reading about, which kingdom. And as you become more familiar with the kings, you may not need it as much, because you can say, oh yeah, I remember this. He was reigning in the southern kingdom or the northern kingdom. Granted, it can be confusing. As you can see, I've stumbled a little bit through it, and I've been studying it for years now. But just if you decide to tackle it, hang in there. It's going to take a few times reading through it to really get it set in your mind as to actually what's going on with the kingdoms, whether it's southern or northern. So I hope this has been helpful, and we're nearing the end of the history of the nation of Israel, and soon we'll be moving into poetry and prophecy.